The prisoner who served 16 years in prison for a crime he says he did not commit. The body was found just after sunrise, lying in the shallow grass off a quiet Florida road. The air was thick with heat and insects, the kind of morning where sweat forms before you even move. A patrol officer stood frozen for a moment, staring down at the still figure, already knowing this case wouldn't be clean. The victim was a man named James Dees. A small-time hustler. Known locally. Not powerful. Not invisible. Just important enough that someone would want answers fast. Tire marks scarred the dirt nearby, but they were smudged and overlapping, useless in the Florida soil. There was no weapon left behind. No witnesses stepping forward. Just a dead man and the pressure to solve it. Within hours, the sheriff's office felt it. The phone calls. The quiet urgency from above. A murder without a suspect doesn't stay unsolved for long in small communities, not because justice is swift, but because someone always gets chosen. And before the day ended, a name was already circulating. William Dillon. Dillon wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He was just there, young, broke, rough around the edges, and familiar to law enforcement. That alone made him visible. He had crossed paths with the victim before. Not violently. Not memorably. But in 1981 Florida, that was enough. Police brought him in for questioning under the pretense of clearing things up. The interview room was small. No windows. The hum of fluorescent lights filling every silence. Dillon sat across from detectives who already believed they knew the ending of this story. They asked him where he'd been. He answered. They asked again. Same answer. Hours passed. Voices rose. Doubt was introduced slowly, methodically, like poison added a drop at a time. They told him witnesses had placed him near the scene. They told him evidence would come out either way. They told him cooperation was his only way home. But there was no physical evidence. No blood. No weapon. No fingerprints tying him to the killing. So they waited. The case stalled, until it didn't. A jailhouse informant came forward. A man with his own charges. His own motivations. He claimed Dillon had confessed while they were locked up together. He offered details that sounded convincing enough to people who wanted to believe them. This was the missing piece. The confession Dillon never made became the foundation of the case against him. Investigators ignored inconsistencies. Timelines didn't line up, but they were close enough. The informant's story changed slightly, but not enough to raise alarms. Each gap was patched with assumption. When the state moved forward, the narrative was already written. Dillon was the killer. And everyone was expected to fall in line. The trial moved fast. Too fast. Dillon sat at the defense table watching his life get summarized by strangers who had never met him. Prosecutors painted him as volatile, dangerous, disposable. A man capable of murder because they said so. The jury never saw physical proof, because there wasn't any. They were given testimony instead. Words stacked on words. Certainty manufactured out of confidence. The jailhouse informant spoke clearly. Calmly. He looked at the jury and told them Dillon had admitted everything. Dillon stood and said the opposite. He told them he was innocent. He told them he'd never confessed. He told them this was a mistake. But mistakes sound like excuses when the room has already decided. The verdict came down heavy. Guilty. When the judge sentenced him, the words echoed longer than they should have. Dillon felt his body go numb as the years stacked up. He was barely out of his teens when the doors closed behind him. He entered prison as a boy. He didn't know yet that he would leave as a middle-aged man. Prison doesn't care about innocence. It cares about survival. Dillon learned quickly how to keep his head down. How to listen more than he spoke. How to live inside a system where guilt is assumed and truth is irrelevant. Days blended into years. Appeals were filed and denied. Lawyers came and went. Each one promising hope, each one eventually running out of it. Outside, the world moved on. Inside, time stalled. He watched men come and go, some released, some broken, some buried. He held on to one thing only, the knowledge that he did not kill James Dees. That belief became both his anchor and his torment. Because believing you're innocent in prison doesn't set you free. It just makes the walls louder. Years later, something changed. Quietly, a new kind of evidence began reshaping old cases across the country. DNA testing, once limited, now precise, was reopening convictions everyone thought were settled. Dillon heard rumors first, then whispers. Then a name passed between inmates like contraband. A lawyer. A review unit. A second look. For the first time in years, someone wasn't asking him to explain himself. They were asking questions about the case. Real questions. Boxes were pulled from storage. Yellowing files. Evidence bags sealed decades earlier. Reports written in a different era, by people who had long since retired or died. And inside those boxes was the truth everyone had ignored. The biological evidence from the crime scene, never tested properly, didn't belong to William Dillon. Not even close. When the results came back, they hit like a gunshot in a silent room. The DNA excluded him completely. The man the system had caged for 16 years could not have committed the crime he was serving time for. Suddenly, the foundation of the case cracked. Then it collapsed. Investigators revisited the informant's testimony. His incentives. His inconsistencies. His deals. What once sounded convincing now sounded desperate. Self-serving. Fragile. The circumstantial case unraveled thread by thread. And the question that followed was worse than the answer. How did this happen? How did a man lose 16 years of his life without proof? As lawyers prepared to bring the findings before a judge, Dillon waited. This time, waiting felt different. Dangerous. Hope has a way of hurting more than despair when it's been gone too long. He had seen false hope before. He had learned not to trust it. In a courtroom decades removed from his original trial, Dillon listened as the case against him was dismantled. Evidence once called strong was now labeled unreliable. Testimony once trusted was now exposed as self-serving fiction. The state had no choice. The conviction could not stand. When the judge ordered his release, the room went silent. 16 years. Gone. Just like that. But freedom doesn't arrive clean. Dillon walked out into a world that had forgotten him. Technology he didn't recognize. Streets that felt smaller. People younger than him who had lived entire lives while his had been paused. He was free, but not restored. And as reporters rushed to call it a victory, Dillon knew the truth was heavier. The real crime wasn't just the murder. It was what happened after. And as investigators dug deeper into the case they once thought closed, they realized something even more disturbing. The DNA didn't just clear William Dillon. It pointed somewhere else. And whoever that DNA belonged to had never been questioned at all. The state moved carefully once the DNA results landed. There were no press conferences. No confident statements. Just quiet meetings behind closed doors where prosecutors reread transcripts they hadn't touched in years. Words that once sounded solid now rang hollow. Phrases like beyond a reasonable doubt felt fragile when stacked against a laboratory report that said, plainly, this DNA is not his. William Dillon sat in his cell when the news reached him. Not from a lawyer. Not officially. From a guard who stopped outside the bars longer than usual and said, almost awkwardly, "You might want to call your attorney." Hope didn't rush in. It crept. Dillon had learned what hope could do when it arrived too fast. He stayed still, gripping the edge of his bunk, breathing through the moment like it might pass if he acknowledged it too quickly. For 16 years, the system had spoken with authority. Now, for the first time, it hesitated. The review began with evidence that had always existed but had never truly been examined. Biological material recovered from the victim's clothing. Samples logged, sealed, and shelved in an era when forensic science lacked the tools to speak clearly. Back then, inconclusive had been treated like good enough. Now it meant something else. Technicians reran the tests. Checked them twice. Then a third time. Each result landed the same way. The genetic profile did not match Dillon. It never had. That single fact forced everything else into question. Investigators returned to the jailhouse informant's statements with fresh eyes. They mapped his claims against verified timelines. They noticed how details shifted subtly over time. How incentives aligned neatly with moments of cooperation. How his testimony filled gaps the prosecution needed filled. What once looked like a witness now looked like a deal. And deals don't prove guilt. They prove opportunity. Dillon's defense team worked around the clock, not because the case was complex, but because it was fragile. Years of assumptions had to be dismantled carefully, piece by piece, without triggering resistance from a system reluctant to admit error. They filed motions. They requested hearings. They presented the DNA evidence alongside expert testimony explaining what it meant and what it didn't. It didn't prove who killed James Dees, but it proved who didn't. That distinction mattered. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors shifted uncomfortably as their own case was turned against itself. Arguments once delivered with confidence were now defended with caution. The jailhouse informant's credibility crumbled under scrutiny. His motivations were laid bare. His rewards acknowledged. The circumstantial evidence, stripped of narrative, amounted to coincidence. Coincidence had stolen 16 years. For Dillon, the days dragged. He returned to his cell after each hearing with the same routine he'd perfected over decades. Count time. Lockdown. He watched other men celebrate small victories, a reduced sentence, a successful appeal, while he waited for a decision that would redefine his existence. Freedom had become abstract. He imagined walking outside without permission, buying food without a number attached to his name, sleeping without listening for keys. But imagination didn't open doors. Judges did. When the ruling finally came, it wasn't dramatic. The judge spoke carefully, choosing words that balanced legal restraint with unavoidable truth. The conviction, he said, could not stand. The DNA evidence undermined the foundation of the state's case. The testimony that had secured the verdict was unreliable. The courtroom held its breath. William Dillon was ordered released. Not retried. Released. For a moment, the words didn't register. 16 years had taught him not to expect clean endings. Then the weight shifted. His knees weakened. His hands shook. The room blurred at the edges as people stood, moved, reacted. He remained seated. Free didn't feel real yet. The gates opened a few days later under a Florida sky that felt too bright. Cameras waited beyond the fence. Reporters called his name. Microphones stretched toward his face, eager for a quote that could summarize a lifetime of loss. Dillon stepped forward slowly. He looked older than his years. His movements carried the caution of someone used to asking permission. He squinted against the light, adjusting to a world that had advanced without him. He was free. But the system did not say, "We were wrong." It said, "You may go." Public reaction came fast. Headlines called it a miscarriage of justice. Commentators debated how such an error could persist for so long. Civil rights advocates pointed to the dangers of incentivized testimony and outdated forensic standards. But inside court records, language stayed clinical. No apology. No accountability. Just a corrected outcome. Dillon returned to a society that expected gratitude, that expected closure, that expected him to move on. He tried. But innocence doesn't refund time. As journalists dug deeper, uncomfortable details surfaced. The informant who testified against Dillon had received leniency, reduced time, better conditions, promises never disclosed fully to the jury. Prosecutors claimed they acted within the law as it existed at the time. Technically, they were right. Morally, the answer felt incomplete. Dillon's lawyers explored civil action, but lawsuits move slowly, and justice has a way of arriving long after the damage is done. Compensation discussions stalled. Appeals dragged. Bureaucracy filled the silence where accountability should have lived. For Dillon, each delay echoed the same truth he'd learned in prison. The system does not hurry for the innocent. Meanwhile, another question loomed larger with each passing day. If Dillon didn't commit the murder, who did? The DNA profile remained unmatched in state databases. The trail was cold. Evidence degraded. Witnesses scattered or deceased. Time had done what it always does, erased the edges of truth. Investigators quietly admitted the case might never be solved. A man had been murdered. Another man had lost 16 years. And the person responsible might never face consequences. That realization sat heavy. Dillon struggled with freedom. He missed meals. He startled at sudden noises. He slept lightly, waking before dawn out of habit. Crowds made him anxious. Choices overwhelmed him. Prison had stripped life down to structure. Freedom demanded navigation. He found work eventually. Low profile. Physical. Honest. He avoided attention when he could, but his name carried a story people recognized. Some treated him like a symbol. Others like a curiosity. Few treated him like a man trying to rebuild. Late one evening, sitting alone in a small apartment, Dillon replayed moments he couldn't get back. Birthdays missed. Funerals he never attended. Relationships frozen in time. He thought about the jurors who convicted him. The informant who lied. The prosecutors who never looked back. He thought about the DNA that finally spoke when no one else would. And he realized something that cut deeper than anger. If science hadn't advanced when it did, he might still be in that cell. If evidence had been lost instead of stored, he might have died behind bars. His freedom was not guaranteed. It was accidental. That truth fueled a new determination. Dillon began speaking publicly, not loudly, not theatrically, but honestly. He talked about the fragility of justice. About how certainty is often manufactured. About how easily a narrative can replace evidence when pressure demands an answer. He didn't claim the system was evil. He claimed it was careless. And carelessness, he knew, was just as dangerous. As years passed, his case became a reference point. Cited in reports. Discussed in law schools. Used to argue for reform in how informants are handled and how forensic evidence is preserved. But for Dillon, the lesson was simpler. Freedom can be taken without proof. And returning it doesn't erase the damage. One night, during an interview long after the headlines faded, Dillon was asked the question everyone expected. How does it feel to be free? He paused longer than the reporter anticipated. Free is a word, he said finally. What I got back was space. Time doesn't come back. The camera kept rolling. And in that silence, the true cost of the mistake became clear. But even as his story reshaped conversations about justice, another reality lingered in the background. The DNA profile was still unmatched. The real killer was still out there, or had never been held to account at all. And that meant the system hadn't just failed once. It was still failing. Waiting. For someone else to pay the price. William Dillon learned quickly that freedom does not arrive with instructions. The first nights were the hardest. Silence felt wrong. No metal doors slamming. No keys rattling down a corridor. He woke before sunrise every day, heart racing, body braced for a count that never came. 16 years had trained him to expect confinement. Release felt like standing on unstable ground. Outside, people told him he was lucky. They meant well. But luck had nothing to do with it. Luck is winning something you didn't earn. Dillon had survived something he didn't deserve. The state never apologized. There was no official acknowledgement of error. No statement admitting failure. The conviction was vacated, the charges dismissed, and the file quietly closed. In legal language, it was a correction. In human terms, it was devastation without accountability. Dillon tried to rebuild anyway. He found work where he could. Jobs that didn't ask too many questions. Jobs that valued reliability over history. He learned how to use a cell phone. Learned how to navigate a world where technology had advanced faster than compassion. Every form asked the same question. Have you ever been convicted of a felony? The answer was complicated. The record still existed. Exoneration did not erase the past. It only reclassified it. Journalists came and went. Some wanted justice stories. Others wanted tragedy. A few wanted something darker, anger, bitterness, rage they could package neatly. Dillon gave them none of it. He spoke carefully, deliberately. He refused to perform pain. What haunted him most wasn't prison itself. It was the realization that the system never truly stopped to question itself. That the same mechanisms that put him away were still operating, unchanged, confident, waiting for the next convenient suspect. He wasn't an anomaly. He was a warning. Behind the scenes, advocates pushed for reform using Dillon's case as evidence. They argued against uncorroborated jailhouse informants. They demanded stricter standards for forensic evidence. They called for accountability when convictions collapse. Progress was slow. Committees formed. Reports were written. Recommendations were made. But systems rarely move with urgency unless forced. And no one forced them. The murder of James Dees remained officially unsolved. The DNA profile sat in a database, anonymous and cold. No match. No suspect. No closure. Investigators admitted privately that time had stolen their chances. Evidence degraded. Memories faded. Witnesses disappeared. A man was killed. Another man lost 16 years. And the truth sat somewhere unreachable between them. That reality settled into Dillon's life like a permanent ache. He wasn't just living with what had been taken from him. He was living with what hadn't been fixed. At night, Dillon replayed the trial in his head. The informant's voice. The jury's faces. The moment the verdict was read. He wondered how easily certainty had replaced doubt. He wondered how many other men were sitting in cells right now, telling the truth to people who had already decided they were lying. That thought kept him awake more than any memory of prison ever had. Eventually, Dillon began visiting prisons, not as an inmate, but as a witness. He spoke to men who claimed innocence. Some convincingly. Some desperately. Some dishonestly. He never pretended he could tell the difference. That wasn't the point. The point was that no system should rely on belief when proof is required. He told them his story not to offer hope, but perspective. Time doesn't care if you're innocent, he said. You have to fight for yourself even when nobody's listening. Sometimes they listened. Sometimes they didn't. Years later, Dillon stood in a small courtroom again, not as a defendant, but as an observer. Another wrongful conviction was being overturned. Another life cracked open by evidence that should have mattered the first time. He watched the man break down as the judge ordered his release. He recognized the expression. Relief mixed with disbelief. Gratitude tangled with grief. Freedom arriving too late. When Dillon was asked if he felt justice had been served, he answered honestly. No, he said. Justice would have been not taking it in the first place. That sentence followed him. It appeared in articles. In reports. In speeches. It became shorthand for something uncomfortable, the idea that fixing a mistake does not undo it. The system measured success in reversals. Dillon measured it in years lost. Today, his name appears in case studies and legal textbooks. Students debate how the conviction happened, how it lasted, how it fell apart. They analyze errors with clinical detachment, confident that modern safeguards will prevent repetition. Dillon hopes they're right. But hope, he has learned, is not protection. Vigilance is. The road where James Dees was found looks ordinary now. Cars pass without slowing. Grass grows where evidence once lay. No marker explains what happened there. No sign warns what went wrong afterward. History doesn't announce itself. It waits to be remembered or repeated. William Dillon lives quietly. He avoids the spotlight when he can. He values routine, stability, and small freedoms most people never think about. Choosing when to sleep, when to eat, where to go. He carries his past with him, not as a weapon, but as a reminder. That justice is fragile. That certainty is dangerous. And that once the system decides who you are, proving otherwise can take a lifetime. They say the case is closed. The conviction overturned. The error corrected. But some stories don't end when the file is stamped. They end when the lesson is learned. And for William Dillon, that lesson is clear. Freedom can be taken without proof. And getting it back doesn't mean you ever truly get it back. If you think this story was intense, you're not ready for the next one. Before you scroll past, subscribe, hit like, and leave a comment, because once the story starts, freedom won't mean what you think it does.